The stone slabs beneath Thomas Granger's hands radiated heat that had burned continuously for 39 days without refueling, while outside his Montana cabin, the longest blizzard in recorded history buried everything under 23 feet of snow. Every other trapper within 50 miles was either dead or dying, their fireplaces long exhausted of wood they could no longer gather. But Thomas's fire burned hidden beneath his floor, invisible, efficient, and impossible to extinguish. Before we get into this story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, and if survival stories like this fascinate you, go ahead and subscribe, because tomorrow's episode might just save your life someday. Thomas Granger knelt on the stone platform that formed half his cabin floor and slid his iron poker through the narrow gap between two flat slabs. The metal scraped against rock as he adjusted a piece of pine that had been burning for 6 hours. The wood glowed deep orange in the redder chamber below, releasing heat that radiated upward through the stones into the 16 by 20-foot space that had been his entire world for the past 5 weeks. Outside, wind screamed across the Montana wilderness with a sound like tearing canvas. Snow fell so thick that daylight barely penetrated the single small window. The temperature had not risen above 0 degrees Fahrenheit in 39 days. Thomas withdrew the poker and set it aside. He placed his palm flat against the stone nearest the fire chamber. The surface was hot enough to be uncomfortable after 5 seconds, exactly as it should be. He moved his hand to a slab near the wall, 8 feet from the fire opening, still warm. The heat distribution was working perfectly. The entire floor functioned as a single radiant heating surface, turning his cabin into an environment where he could move about in shirt sleeves despite the Arctic conditions outside. He stood and walked to the small table where his metal pot sat, and steaming. The pot had been positioned on the stones near the fire gap since morning, filled with snow he had gathered from the drift that pressed against his door. The snow had melted hours ago. Now the water simmered gently, heated by nothing more than the warmth radiating through the rock beneath it. Thomas poured the hot water into a tin cup containing a handful of pine needles he had dried months earlier. The tea would be bitter, but it was warm, and it was something other than melted snow. He moved to the window and used his knife to scrape frost from the inside of the thick glass pane. The view outside was white chaos. He could not see more than 10 feet through the blowing snow. Somewhere out there were other trappers in other cabins, if they were still alive. Thomas knew what they were facing. Traditional fireplaces consumed enormous amounts of wood, and when you could not leave your cabin to gather more fuel, you had perhaps 3 days of warmth before the cold came inside, with you. After that, you burned furniture, then floorboards, then you died. Thomas had 3 pieces of firewood remaining in his cabin. At his current consumption rate, those 3 pieces would last another 9 days. The fire beneath his floor had been burning since the first day of the blizzard, and in all that time he had used only 19 pieces of split pine. A traditional fireplace would have consumed that much wood in a single day and wasted most of the heat up the chimney. His hidden fire wasted nothing. Every bit of heat generated in the stone chamber below radiated into his living space, or was absorbed by the thermal mass of the rocks themselves, which held warmth for hours after the flames died down. The winter of 1836 began with promise. Thomas Granger and David Marsh had established their trapping camp in September along a tributary of the Yellowstone River, and by December they had collected nearly 200 beaver pelts worth a small fortune in Street, Louis. Their cabin was standard construction for the era, built in 5 days using notched logs and moss chinking. The fireplace was river stone and mud, functional but crude. They had stacked cordwood against the north wall, enough split pine to last what they assumed would be a typical Montana winter. The first serious storm arrived on January 8th. Snow fell for 6 days straight, accumulating 4 feet on level ground and drifting much higher against their cabin. When the storm finally cleared, David and Thomas ventured out to check their trap lines. They found the traps buried and the beaver ponds frozen solid under 3 feet of ice. Trapping was finished until spring. They returned to the cabin and settled in to wait out the rest of winter. The second storm hit on January 23rd. This one lasted 9 days and brought another 5 feet of snow. The drifts around their cabin now reached above the window. Thomas and David spent hours each day digging a path to their oft-times woodpile, which was rapidly disappearing under the accumulation. The fireplace consumed wood at an alarming rate. They burned through 2 full days' worth of split logs every 24 hours just to keep the interior temperature above freezing. By early February, they realized their cordwood supply would not last until spring. They began rationing fire, letting the cabin temperature drop into the 30s during the day and only building up the fire at night. They wore every piece of clothing they owned. They wrapped themselves in beaver pelts. They burned wood sparingly, carefully, but the mathematics were undeniable. At current consumption, they would run out of fuel by mid-March. Spring typically did not arrive until late April. David suggested they venture out to cut more wood. Thomas argued against it. The snow was too deep, the cold too severe. They would exhaust themselves and risk frostbite for a few armloads of frozen timber. David insisted. On February 19th, while Thomas was checking their remaining food supplies, David put on his heavy coat and went outside alone. Thomas found him 3 hours later, collapsed 50 yards from the cabin. David had made it to a stand of dead pine trees and had even managed to cut down one small trunk, but the exertion in deep snow and sub-zero temperatures had overwhelmed him. He had tried to return to the cabin and had not made it. Thomas dragged David's frozen body back and buried him in the snow beside the cabin. There was no way to dig a proper grave through the frozen ground. Thomas burned the tree David had cut. It lasted 1 day. He spent that night alone in the cabin, watching the fire consume wood that had cost his partner's life, and understanding, with perfect clarity, that traditional fireplaces were death traps in extended winter emergencies. Thomas left the mountains in March, when the snow finally melted enough to permit travel. He carried David's personal effects and half the beaver pelts to street. Louis, selling the furs and sending David's share to the man's sister in Pennsylvania, along with a letter explaining what had happened. Thomas spent 2 weeks in the city, but his mind never left the problem that had killed his partner. Every building he passed became a lesson in heat retention. Every fireplace he saw represented wasted energy and fatal inefficiency. Traditional fireplaces failed for reasons Thomas now understood with brutal clarity. First, they vented most of their heat directly up the chimney. The draft that kept smoke flowing out also pulled warm air from the room, creating a continuous cycle of heat loss. Second, they provided only radiant heat from a single point source. Stand near the fire and you were warm. Move 10 feet away and you were cold. Third, they consumed fuel at unsustainable rates because the open design allowed unlimited oxygen flow, causing wood to burn fast and hot rather than slow and efficient. Thomas began calculating. A traditional fireplace in a small cabin required approximately 20 pieces of split firewood per day to maintain livable temperatures in severe cold. A winter storm that prevented wood gathering for even a week would require 140 pieces stockpiled in advance. A 2-week storm needed 280 pieces. A month-long emergency demanded 600 pieces of split, dried firewood stored inside a cabin with perhaps 200 square feet of floor space. The mathematics made extended survival impossible. He spent his evenings in Street Louis visiting the library, a luxury he had never indulged before. He found books on architecture and engineering, skimming past the theoretical sections to focus on practical applications. He learned about thermal mass, the principle that dense materials like stone and brick absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, creating stable temperatures over time. He read about Roman hypocausts, ancient underfloor heating systems that burned fires in chambers, beneath living spaces, allowing hot air and smoke to travel through channels under the floor before venting outside. The concept fascinated him. If fire could heat a floor from below, the entire floor became a radiating surface. Heat would distribute evenly throughout the space rather than concentrating near a single fireplace. Stone floors would absorb heat during burning and release it for hours afterward, reducing the need for constant fuel consumption. The system would be enclosed, limiting oxygen flow and forcing wood to burn slower and more completely. But Roman hypocausts required elaborate construction with underground channels, multiple chambers, and external chimneys. Thomas did not have the resources or knowledge to build something that complex. He needed a simplified version, something a single man could construct using frontier materials and basic tools. He needed a fire that burned beneath the floor but did not require engineering expertise he did not possess. Thomas returned to the mountains in May with a plan forming in his mind and determination that bordered on obsession. Thomas returned to the same tributary where David had died, but he built his new camp 2 miles upstream from the old cabin. He could not live in the place where his partner had frozen. The new location offered better timber and a southern exposure that would maximize winter sunlight. He began construction in early June, giving himself the entire summer and fall to build what he was planning. The first task was stone collection. Thomas needed flat rocks capable of bearing weight and withstanding high temperatures without cracking. He spent 3 weeks searching the riverbanks and hillsides, testing stones by heating them in campfires and observing which types held together and which fractured. Limestone worked well. Dense river granite was excellent. Sandstone was acceptable if he selected carefully. Shale and slate were useless, splitting along their natural layers when heated. He hauled stones to his building site using a travois made from pine poles and leather straps. Each flat slab weighed between 30 and 70 pounds. He needed enough to cover a floor area of approximately 160 square feet, plus additional stones to construct the fire chamber itself. The work was exhausting and consumed the entire month of July. While gathering stones, Thomas refined his design through constant mental revision. The fire chamber would need to be deep enough to contain flames and coals safely, but not so deep that heat could not radiate upward effectively. He estimated 18 inches would work. The chamber would need airflow for combustion, but limited airflow to prevent rapid burning. He would create a single opening for adding fuel and allowing oxygen intake. The smoke would need to escape, but he wanted to capture as much heat as possible before venting it outside. Thomas studied the ruins of an abandoned army outpost he discovered 15 miles from his site. The fort had been built in 1827 and abandoned 3 years later when the military relocated its operations. The structures were collapsing, but Thomas could examine the stonework and chimney construction. He noticed how the chimneys had smoke shelves, horizontal ledges inside the flue that reflected heat back into the rooms and prevented downdrafts. He measured dimensions and studied mortar techniques. In August, Thomas began experimenting with small-scale models. He built miniature fire chambers using rocks and clay, testing different depths, different air opening sizes, and different stone arrangements. He burned small fires in these models and measured how long they stayed hot, how much smoke they produced, and how efficiently they consumed wood. Most designs failed. Some filled with smoke. Others burned through fuel too quickly. A few worked moderately well. By September, Thomas had identified a design that showed promise. The fire chamber would be rectangular, 18 inches deep, 30 inches wide, and 40 inches long. A single narrow opening would serve for fuel loading and air intake. Flat stone slabs would cover the top, with small gaps between stones to allow minimal smoke escape. A simple chimney would vent smoke outside while capturing maximum heat in the stone mass beneath the floor. Construction could begin. Thomas broke ground on his cabin in mid-September. The structure would be 16 feet by 20 feet, larger than typical trapper cabins, but necessary for what he was planning. He excavated the entire interior to a depth of 2 feet, removing dirt until he reached harder subsoil. In the center of this excavation, he dug an additional 18 inches, creating the pit that would become his fire chamber. The chamber walls required precise construction. Thomas used his flattest stones, stacking them without mortar initially to test the fit. Each stone needed to rest solidly on the one below it, without rocking or gaps. He worked slowly, rejecting stones that did not fit perfectly and searching his stockpile for better options. The process took 2 full weeks to complete just the chamber walls. Once satisfied with the dry fit, Thomas disassembled the walls and rebuilt them using a mortar he had developed through experimentation. He mixed clay from the riverbank with sand, ash from his campfire, and animal hair from deer hides he had processed. The mixture created a heat-resistant mortar that would not crack under the extreme temperatures the chamber would experience. He applied the mortar carefully, ensuring no gaps remained where smoke could leak into the surrounding soil. The chamber opening required special attention. Thomas left a gap on the eastern side, 20 inches wide and extending from the chamber floor to just below the top edge. This opening would serve multiple purposes: fuel loading, oxygen intake, and his access point for managing the fire. He lined the opening edges with his largest, flattest stones to create a stable frame that would not shift over time. Above the fire chamber, Thomas installed the stone platform that would form his floor. He selected his flattest slabs for this purpose, each one at least 2 inches thick and large enough to span significant distances. The stones had to fit together tightly enough to prevent excessive smoke leakage while leaving small, controlled gaps for minimal venting. He laid the slabs in a pattern that distributed weight evenly across the chamber walls below. The critical engineering challenge was the stone directly above the fire opening. This slab would experience the most direct heat and needed to be removable for fire management. Thomas chose his thickest piece of granite, nearly 4 inches deep, and shaped it carefully to rest on the chamber edges without requiring mortar. He could lift this stone when needed to add fuel or adjust the fire, then replace it to seal the chamber. Around the fire chamber, Thomas filled the remaining excavated area with smaller stones and gravel, creating a base layer for the rest of his floor. He tamped this fill material firmly, ensuring it would not settle or shift. Over this base, he laid additional flat stones, creating a continuous floor surface that would absorb and radiate heat from the chamber below. The stone floor alone took 6 weeks to complete. By early November, Thomas was ready to build the cabin walls above his revolutionary heating system. Thomas completed the cabin walls in late November using techniques he had learned during his years in the mountains. The logs were carefully fitted and chinked with clay mixed with pine resin. The roof was layered bark, covered with sod for insulation. He built a small chimney from stones, positioned directly above the fire chamber opening. The chimney was narrow, only 6 inches square internally, designed to vent smoke while retaining as much heat as possible in the stone mass below. On December 3, 1837, Thomas lit the first fire in his hidden chamber. He used dry kindling and small pieces of pine, building the fire slowly to avoid thermal shock that might crack the stones. Smoke rose through the gaps between the floor slabs and traveled up the narrow chimney. Within an hour, the cabin filled with a thin haze. Thomas had anticipated this problem. He opened his door and window, allowing the initial smoke to clear while the fire established a proper draft. The draft issue resolved itself as the chimney warmed. Hot air rising through the narrow flue created suction that pulled smoke up from the chamber rather than allowing it to leak into the cabin. Thomas adjusted the fire, adding larger pieces of wood and monitoring how the system responded. The stones above the fire chamber began warming noticeably within 2 hours. By evening, the entire floor near the chamber was warm enough to be uncomfortable to touch. Thomas spent the first night making careful problem observations. He recorded how long each piece of wood burned, how much heat the stones retained, and how the warmth distributed across the cabin. He discovered that a single piece of split pine, properly placed in the chamber, would burn for approximately 4 hours rather than the 1 hour it would last in an open fireplace. The limited oxygen in the enclosed chamber forced the wood to burn slowly and completely. The thermal mass effect exceeded his expectations. After the fire burned down to coals around midnight, Thomas went to sleep without adding more wood. When he woke 6 hours later, the stones were still warm enough to heat the cabin to a comfortable temperature. The floor had absorbed so much heat during the evening that it continued radiating warmth long after the flames died. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas refined his system through constant adjustments. He discovered that leaving slightly larger gaps between certain floor stones improved draft without losing significant heat. He learned that adding wood every 6 hours maintained optimal temperature with minimal fuel consumption. He found that positioning his cooking pot on specific stones near the fire opening allowed him to boil water and prepare food using only the radiant heat from the floor. By late December, Thomas was consuming only 3 pieces of firewood per day to maintain comfortable interior temperatures, even as outside temperatures dropped below zero. A traditional fireplace would have required 20 pieces for the same warmth. His hidden fire system was 7 times more efficient than conventional heating. Then the blizzard arrived. The sky turned gray on January 4, 1838. Thomas had seen enough Montana winters to recognize the signs of a major storm. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 3 hours. The wind shifted to come straight from the north. The air carried that particular heavy stillness that preceded significant snowfall. Thomas spent the afternoon preparing. He brought his entire woodpile inside the cabin, stacking split logs along the walls until nearly every available space was occupied. He counted 137 pieces. At his current consumption rate of 3 pieces per day, he had enough fuel for 45 days without leaving the cabin. He filled every container he owned with water from the creek, knowing the stream would soon freeze solid. He checked his food supplies: dried venison, pemmican, cornmeal, beans, salt, and a small amount of coffee. Enough for 2 months if he rationed carefully. The snow began falling just after dark. Thomas sealed his door by packing snow and clay mixture around the frame, leaving only enough gap for minimal air exchange. The cabin needed fresh air to prevent suffocation, but he wanted to minimize heat loss. He covered his window with a thick hide he had prepared for this purpose, blocking the cold glass while still allowing a small amount of light to enter during daytime. By morning of January 5th, 8 inches of snow had accumulated. The wind howled constantly, driving the snow horizontally and creating drifts that already reached halfway up his cabin walls. Thomas added wood to his hidden fire and settled into the routine that would sustain him through whatever was coming. The storm intensified. Over the next 3 days, snow fell without pause. The wind screamed across the landscape with sustained speeds that Thomas estimated exceeded 50 miles per hour. Drifts built against his cabin until snow covered the lower half of his walls entirely. He could no longer see out his window even after removing the hide covering. The glass showed only white. On January 8th, Thomas heard a sound that made his blood cold. Someone was shouting outside, barely audible over the wind. He moved to his door and listened. The voice called again, desperate and weakening. Thomas recognized the voice. Robert Pierce, a trapper who had camped 5 miles downstream and had mocked Thomas's elaborate cabin construction back in September. Thomas opened his door against the pressure of accumulated snow. He saw Pierce stumbling through waist-deep drifts, coatless, his hands already blackened with frostbite. Pierce collapsed 10 feet from the cabin entrance. Thomas dragged him inside and sealed the door. Pierce was semi-conscious, mumbling incoherently. His cabin had burned down the previous night when his fireplace set the roof ablaze. He had been wandering through the storm for hours trying to find help. Thomas removed Pierce's frozen boots and clothing, wrapped him in furs, and positioned him on the warm stone floor near the fire chamber. Pierce's survival was uncertain, but at least he was out of the storm. Thomas added another piece of wood to the hidden fire and prepared for a long siege. Robert Pierce survived, though he lost 3 fingers and 2 toes to frostbite. For the first week, he drifted in and out of consciousness, his body slowly recovering from severe hypothermia on the warm stone floor that Thomas had engineered. By the second week, Pierce was lucid enough to understand what had saved his life. He watched Thomas manage the hidden fire with minimal fuel consumption and began to comprehend the genius of the system he had once ridiculed. The storm never stopped. Snow fell every single day through January and into February. Some days brought light flurries. Other days delivered blizzard conditions with 0 visibility and wind that shook the cabin walls. The drifts around Thomas's structure grew until the cabin was buried under snow up to the roofline. Only the chimney remained exposed, a narrow stone column rising from a white landscape that showed no other features. Thomas established a strict routine. He added 3 pieces of wood to the hidden fire each day, spaced 8 hours apart, morning, afternoon, and evening. The rhythm never varied. Each piece burned slowly in the oxygen-limited chamber, releasing heat that the stones absorbed and radiated for hours. The floor temperature remained consistently warm enough that both men could move about in light clothing despite the Arctic conditions outside. Water came from snow that Thomas collected by opening the door briefly each morning and scooping drifted snow from directly outside the entrance. He placed the snow in his metal pot on the hot stones near the fire opening. Within 2 hours, the snow melted. Within 4 hours, the water reached boiling temperature. He used the hot water for drinking, cooking, and maintaining basic hygiene. Food was rationed carefully. Thomas prepared one substantial meal per day, usually a stew made from dried venison, beans, and whatever ingredients remained. The pot sat on the heated stones for hours, slowly cooking the contents without requiring direct flame. The passive cooking method saved fuel and produced meals that were hot and nourishing. Pierce talked extensively during the long days of confinement. He described how quickly his traditional fireplace had consumed his woodpile. He explained how the constant draft from the chimney had created cold spots throughout his cabin despite the roaring fire. He recounted the night his roof caught fire from sparks, how the flames spread within minutes, how he had grabbed nothing but his rifle and run into the storm because staying meant burning alive. By mid-February, Thomas had consumed 63 pieces of firewood. A traditional fireplace would have burned through more than 800 pieces in the same period. His hidden fire system was operating exactly as designed, providing consistent warmth with minimal fuel. He had 74 pieces remaining. The mathematics indicated he could survive another 74 days if necessary. The storm continued. The wind never fully stopped. Snow fell or blew constantly. Thomas marked each day by cutting a small notch into a wooden beam near his sleeping platform. By the end of February, he had carved 42 notches, 42 days of continuous winter siege. On February 16th, the wind stopped. The silence woke Thomas from sleep, so complete and sudden that he initially thought something was wrong with his hearing. He rose from his sleeping platform and moved to the window. Daylight filtered through the snow-covered glass, but the howling that had been constant for 43 days was absent. The storm had finally ended. Thomas and Pierce spent 2 hours digging out the door. Snow had drifted against it to a depth of 7 feet, packed solid by weeks of wind. They worked in shifts, scooping snow into the cabin and melting it on the heated floor stones, allowing the water to drain through cracks into the soil below. When they finally broke through to outside air, the landscape was unrecognizable. Everything was white and silent. Drifts had erased all familiar landmarks. Trees were buried to their upper branches. The creek was invisible somewhere, beneath 20 feet of accumulated snow. The sky was clear and intensely blue, the first cloudless day since early January. The temperature was still well below zero, but without wind, the cold felt almost gentle. Pierce left 3 days later, heading downstream toward what remained of his burned cabin to salvage anything useful. Thomas never saw him again, though he later heard that Pierce survived and told everyone he met about the hidden fire system that had saved his life. Within a week of Pierce's departure, another visitor arrived. Henry Calloway was a trapper Thomas knew by reputation but had never met. Calloway had wintered 30 miles north and had weathered the storm in a cave, surviving on dried meat and melted snow, but enduring 42 days of brutal cold with only a small fire that he could barely keep alive. He had heard about Thomas's cabin from Pierce and had traveled 5 days through chest-deep snow to see it for himself. Thomas showed Calloway everything. He lifted the stone slab above the fire opening and explained how the chamber worked. He demonstrated the slow-burning technique that made wood last 4 times longer than open fires. He described the thermal mass principle, how the stones absorbed heat and radiated it for hours. He explained the chimney design, the controlled airflow, the strategic gaps between floor stones that allowed smoke to escape without losing excessive heat. Calloway listened with the attention of a man who understood he was witnessing something revolutionary. He asked detailed questions about construction techniques, stone selection, and chamber dimensions. He spent 3 days at Thomas's cabin, studying every aspect of the system and taking measurements. When Calloway finally left, he carried complete knowledge of how to build a hidden fire system. He also carried the names of 11 trappers who had died during the 42-day storm, frozen in their cabins when their fireplaces consumed all available fuel, and the cold came inside to claim them. 11 men who might have survived if they had known what Thomas had discovered. The innovation had come too late for them, but not too late for everyone. Henry Calloway built the first replica of Thomas's system in the fall of 1838. His cabin, constructed 40 miles north of Thomas's location, incorporated every principle Thomas had shared. Calloway added his own refinement, a secondary chamber that preheated incoming air before it reached the main fire, further improving efficiency. He survived the winter of 1838 through 39 using half the fuel Thomas had required. Word spread through the scattered trapping community with the speed that only life-saving information travels. By 1840, at least 15 cabins in the northern Rockies had been built with hidden fire systems. Each builder added modifications based on local materials and personal preferences, but the core concept remained Thomas's. Fire contained beneath stone floors, thermal mass providing heat storage, controlled combustion, extending fuel efficiency. The technique reached beyond trappers. Army scouts building remote outposts adopted the system for winter survival. Trading posts constructed permanent buildings using underground fire chambers that could heat large spaces with minimal wood consumption. Settlers moving into Montana and Wyoming territories sought out men who knew how to build in the Granger style, the name that had attached itself to Thomas's innovation despite his never claiming ownership. James Whitmore, an Army engineer, studied an existing hidden fire cabin in 1843 and wrote a detailed report for the military. His documentation included precise measurements, material specifications, and construction sequences. The report circulated through frontier military posts and became unofficial standard guidance for cold weather shelter construction. Whitmore's report never mentioned Thomas by name, but it preserved the technical knowledge that had originated in one man's obsessive response to tragedy. Thomas himself left the mountains in 1845. The fur trade was collapsing as beaver populations declined and fashion shifted away from felt hats. He sold his cabin and trap lines to a younger trapper and traveled to Oregon Territory, where he purchased land and established a small farm. He married Catherine Williams in 1847, a widow with 2 children who needed a husband with practical skills and steady temperament. Thomas built their farmhouse using conventional construction. Oregon's mild winters did not require the extreme measures he had developed for Montana survival, but he incorporated one feature from his mountain experience: a stone floor in the main room built over a shallow heat chamber. The system was unnecessary for survival, but provided comfortable warmth during winter months and reminded Thomas of the innovation that had saved his life. He died in 1871 at age 58, never famous, never wealthy, but surrounded by family on land he owned. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his past as a mountain man, but said nothing about the heating system he had invented. Catherine knew the story but told it rarely, and after her death in 1886, the connection between Thomas Granger and the hidden fire technique was largely forgotten. But in the mountains, the cabins remained. Some still stand today, stone floors intact, silent testimony to what one man's determination and intelligence accomplished when survival demanded impossible innovation.